Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to start the second session now, which is on understanding gender-based violence in sport. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for this is Emma Pullen, who is the research lead for women in sport at Loughborough University. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning everybody. The bell has rung, so we should all be in our seats. Thank you for the introduction. So today's session is based around understanding gender-based violence. And we're going to use this time to unpack approaches to gender-based violence and explore challenges and opportunities for addressing gender-based violence. To get us going, to start the conversation, we're going to start the session with a keynote from Professor Carrie Fasting from the Norwegian University School of Sport Sciences before moving into our discussion with our expert panel. So, brief introduction to Professor Carrie Fasting. Carrie is one of the pioneers with respect to prevalence studies on gender-based violence. She is an expert consultant in prevention and safeguarding for the Norwegian NOC and has worked with UNICEF, the Council of Europe and the EU. Carrie has provided expert input to the IOC's consensus statement on violence in sports, and she's a founding member and past president of Women's Sport International and a founding member of Safe Sport International. In her keynote, Carrie will provide an overview of the contemporary evidence and the state of play of gender-based violence in the sports sector. And that will provide us with a great starting point for further discussion with our expert panel, who I'll bring up to the stage after the keynote. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Carrie Fasting.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's always nice to be in Lausanne, even though I have seen better weather sometimes. I have this huge task, I would say. You know, it's 15 minutes, and to give an overview, that's not possible. So I had to take out some themes, and I've taken out 3 themes. It is definitions of gender-based violence, it's something about prevalence, and then it's something about reporting, which I think is an area where we lack knowledge. So I will first, as I said, say something about definitions, then about what do we know about prevalence and the different forms of violence, and what do we know about disclosure and or reporting violence in sport. And of course, also very important, what is the prerequisites for reporting? And then I will, at the end, give you an example of a reporting system that the Norwegian Olympic Paralympic Committee has developed and have implemented or are implementing. So, why are definitions and numbers about violence important? If we look at definitions, it is actually a prerequisite for research. It is a prerequisite for how we measure violence. And because violence is defined very differently, you will see different measurements. It also sets out that what behaviors and actions are considered as violence, which is important when developing a policy, particularly with respect to safeguarding and education. It should also assist athletes, coaches, administrators in learning what we may constitute violence, and therefore behaviors that are not tolerated. Many people don't know what violence is, particularly not harassment. What then about numbers? Why do we need to have these figures? It is very important. There are so many governments and sports organizations who have been denial in this area, and they need numbers. IOC is a very good example. In 2006, they thought this didn't exist. They had 12 academics coming here to Lausanne and present what we know, and then they were convinced that this is actually also happening in sport. So it's necessary for informed decision making in policy, and it's also necessary for identifying high risk groups. And that again is necessary for tailored prevention and protection programs. So what is gender-based violence? It refers to harmful acts directed at an individual or a group of individuals based on their gender. It's a very challenging concept, and many people don't use it anymore, because how can we know that the harmful acts is based on their gender? But it's rooted in gender inequality, so it has a lot to do with just what was said in the first session. It's abuse of power and harmful norms, so it's also very related to some of the speakers in this session we just have heard. It's primarily used to underscore the fact that structural gender-based power differential place women and girls at risk for multiple forms of violence. And while women and girls suffer disproportionately from gender-based violence, men and boys can also be targeted. And the term is also sometimes today used to describe targeted violence against LGBTQI+ populations, when referencing violence related to norms of masculinity and femininity and/or gender norms. Gender-based violence is not used very much in sport. There are some studies, the study I did in Zambia, I used it, but researchers in sports sciences are using the term either non-accidental violence or interpersonal violence. If you look at studies over the last 5 years, you will see in sport, you will see that it's interpersonal violence that first of all are used. This is another definition. This is from Europe, Council of Europe. It's some of the same. But it's very clearly, it says violence directed against a person because of that person's gender, including gender identity and expression, or violence that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. I can't go into why I think this is very problematic, the definitions, because I don't have time, but I would say there are normally, most often, it's these 4 types of gender-based violence that are described: physical, sexual, emotional, and socioeconomic violence. And if we look at the research in sport, it's the 3 first one where we have knowledge. We have very few, almost, so that's really a gap for this GO to look into. We have very little knowledge about socioeconomic violence in sport. So what are sports researchers using? They are using as a base often the definition of violence from World Health Organization, the intentional use of physical force or power, threaten or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a highly likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. WHO operates with 3 types of violence: self-directed, interpersonal, and collective violence. And NATO, 4 different types of violence acts: physical, sexual, psychological, and neglect or deprivation. And it's in this area we have knowledge from sports science. And interpersonal violence, it's the same definition, but it is when it's against other persons by an individual or a small group of individuals. And it can occur online, which you will hear in the debate, be perpetrated by different actors, and it can also take different forms. That was the my first part, and then what do we know? What do we know about prevalence? Most studies in sport are prevalent studies. There are very few incident studies. Now, what is the difference? It's actually quite important to know. This comes from medicine, these concepts. The prevalent studies is, for example, have you ever experienced? So that it is the total amount over a lifetime. It's also sometimes called lifetime studies. Incident studies is for a certain period of time. So in the workplace, for example, the studies in workplaces almost always last 12 months, sometimes last 6 months. Incident studies is important to see if some projects have had impact or not, because you can measure it, you know what happened at that time, and then 1 year later or some years later. In sport, we almost don't have any incident studies. I think there are 2. I've just finished one, or finishing up one in Norway. So it's prevalent studies going back, the studies that we have. And most of them are about children and youth, and they are retrospective. It means that one asks people past 18 years of age, how did this happen to you before you were 18 or 16 years of age? So the data that I will show you refers to 98% of studies like this. We also know very little about adult athletes because of the just I told you. But of course athletes, but it's a gap. Also athletes past 18 years, of course, also experience violence in sport. And there are just a couple of studies also about adults. Most studies are on most studies are on athletes. There's very little about other roles in sports, like referees, coaches, etc. Coaches themselves, they are also harassed. And there are some data, actually in my Norwegian study, it seems that the group of different roles in sport that are really, and particularly women, is referees or judges. We also have, of these different forms of violence, we have most studies about sexual violence, often formulated as sexual harassment and abuse, followed by psychological violence or emotional abuse, and relatively little about physical violence and neglect. So, what are the results of the studies that exist? Athletes experience far more psychological violence than other forms. And we have in sport until now focused a lot in relation to prevention of sexual violence. I think it's important now also because many studies, all the latest studies who have measured these 3 different forms shows that it's by far what athletes experience is psychological violence. The overall interpersonal violence prevalence in these studies range from 44 to 86%. Now you may say that's a big gap. Why it's a big gap? It's because they use different definitions, different methodology, different statistical procedures. Therefore it's important to, if it's interesting to compare different countries or different sports, to use the same design for the study. Girls seem to experience more sexual violence and neglect than boys, but boys experience often more physical violence than girls. And so far there's no gender differences found for psychological violence. That was this. Being an elite level athlete is a risk. This is a study I did in Czech Republic some years ago. I think it was the first that showed this very clearly. 3 different forms of performance levels. But other studies later have also showed that being an elite level athlete can be a risk in itself. I will now show you, just to demonstrate this, what I have said actually. I will show you some numbers just from 2 studies. The first study is about children. It's a huge study, took part in 6 countries, 10,000 participants. They were 18 to 30 years of age, but they were asked about what happened before they were 18 years of age. And you see here that what I have said also in this study, psychological violence highest, followed by physical violence, and the sexual violence here are divided into, which often is done, non-contact sexual violence and contact sexual violence. But what really shocked the whole world, not the whole world, but many of us in the field when this was published, was that boys experience more on all these, and it was statistically significant in these 6 countries. The authors can actually not explain it, but I will not go into personally what I think it's the reason for this. But you can see and this was in all 6 countries. So it's girls are calling things women's violence against women only, at least in a sports setting, don't see it to be correct. Then it's my own study that I'm writing up at the moment. That was Norwegian women aged 18 to 30 years of age, being asked about what they had experienced the last 12 months, 1,061 people. And the same, not the same, but we found that psychological violence they have experienced the most, followed by sexual, and then physical. In this, I used a battery that are measuring 4 different forms of sexual violence: gender harassment, and unwanted sexual attention, and also coercion and abuse. But there the number were less than 10, so we don't publish those results. But you see gender harassment, and this is much closer to gender-based violence, or that is gender-based violence, to say it like that. And it's also almost the only study we have from sport, because gender harassment has not been measured in most of these other studies. So that's what of gender-based violence in this study, what people experience the most. We also found statistical difference between sexual violence and between women and men. You can see 34% on sexual and 19 only for men. So this is also what is found in other studies, but not in the big study from Europe on children. So my last point, disclosing and reporting. You know, this is difficult for people who are not English speaking. Often these different concepts and what are we using, and we cannot translate it from our mother language, etc. But this, I think, is important. Disclosing means that you are talking about what had happened to you and telling people about it. But it's not necessarily a formal report. What we know from sport is that disclosing, many female athletes, particularly female athletes, do that. And they do it in a way that they talk with other female athletes, often on the team. They also can protect each other in some situation because they know of the coach's uncomfortable behavior and things like that. But they don't report it. Reporting is also to make a formal statement or complaint about someone or something to a necessary authority. A necessary authority for change. So every time, as Sanderson and others write, every time someone comes forward, it makes it easier for the next survivor to be heard. I give you 3 examples from 3 different studies. One is from Canada. Current and former national team athletes, 44% and 48% told someone but only 16 and 13% submitted a formal report complaint. From Norway, a study about high school elite athletes, 19% disclosed to someone, just a couple had used the reporting system in their school. And a large study from US, student athletes at 10 NCAA Division I institutions, only 9% of participants who experienced sexual violence filled in a formal report at their institutions. This is, the way I see it, a huge problem. Because if you don't report, the organizations or government or club or whatever, it cannot, the abuser or the perpetrator is not taken. And he or she will continue with it, we know that. So we have to have a kind of campaign, I think, in the world to get people to report so that these people can stop with their behavior. Very few studies, but a couple in sport about why don't people report violence. It's fear. It's fear of consequences, of exclusions, punishment, not being believed, gossip, and fear of negative perceptions and responses of teammates and coaches because of stereotypes based on gender, race, and sexual orientation. And often this in English, intersectionality. It's fear of shame, guilt, and embarrassment. And sometimes it's also lack of knowledge to report. And one which seems to be the largest in many studies is they don't think what happened was serious enough. That's an answer you often get. Or didn't believe the reporting would be taken seriously enough and lead to any changes. So what are some of the prerequisites for reporting? All sport bodies should have a safeguarding policy. An important part of safeguarding is, of course, to have a reporting system in place. And even more important, those who deliver a complaint or report must feel safe. They must trust the reporting system. And safeguarding is not only about prevention, it's also about response. So it's important to have a system for support for people who experience this. There is a discussion going on internationally at the moment if these complaint systems should be inside the sports organizations or if it should be outside. Canada has chosen outside, but this is not from. This is from particularly from Hockey Canada, who have such a system. In Norway, we have chosen the opposite. Norwegian Olympic Committee think it's important that it stands inside sport, particularly in relation to the fact that it's if one wants to change the culture and the learning, educational aspects. We have made something called in Norwegian midtvarsel, which is not possible to translate to English. At least it's very difficult. For receiving registration, processing reports and cases. The system is designed so that all reports that are sent in are received by the correct federations. There is a common internet site for reporting and information page, and training materials and templates to strengthen this. And today, out of the sport clubs in Norway, which is about 1,000, about half have sport clubs has received training how to handle the complaint. And there is a network of advisors in each region on handling cases that work directly with clubs and whistleblowers. I've got that I have to close now, but I am closing. The digital platform is designed to assure quality assurance when receiving and processing cases, systematic approach in processes and training, and safe storage of cases and documentation. And this system is, of course, tailored to our culture, to the needs and organization of Norwegian sport and clubs. This is my last slides. what happens if no one reports? The athletes don't get help, fewer athletes report, there's a large chance that the perpetrator continues the behavior, and more athletes will then experience violence. This was what I planned to say in this short time. I could have talked about other things, particularly the perpetrators and the impacts of this in sports science, but I just want to say thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, for that. What I'd like to do next is introduce our expert panel and bring them up to the stage so we can start a bit of a dialogue. So, those in the audience, please welcome Nancy McLennan from UNESCO, Joanna Marenhauer from the Athletes Network for Safer Sports, and Dr. Emma Kavanagh from Bournemouth University. And Carrie, do you want to also take a seat? Yeah. I think you are part of the expert panel, Carrie. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to the panel and they're going to introduce their work, give a brief overview of what their organisations are doing in this space. So I'll start with, well, if we go Emma. Emma, do you want to start?
Firstly, thank you to Kari, Professor Fasting. I look at the work that so many of us have done, and being able to lead on and learn from you over my career has been absolutely, pivotal. But I'm going to go back a little bit in terms of an introduction to me. I am a sports psychologist as well as a researcher, and I started my journey in research thinking about adult athlete experiences. So listening to where are the gaps, what do we need to look at? And in one of my first studies, asking adult athletes about their experiences of interpersonal violence in sport. And it might have been a snapshot in time, but I think it was also into a window into time and place that they started talking about, try having a social media following. So I was looking at elite athletes and their experiences of violence, and suddenly I was hearing about technology, this change. And we all know, I mean, even when I'm sat in the audience and I'm looking around, most of us are connected to our phones in some way. We have an online experience that is very much part of our everyday experience. And there's been lots of positive implications of online environments, especially for women and girls. So I think I want to stress that. I'll say one positive thing about them in terms of connection, brand recognition, voice, disclosure, so platforms for disclosure and collective voice and action. So whilst I can be quite down on online environments, there are positives. I started to look in this area and realised that little to nothing had been done looking at, well, what are the types of violence that can occur? And I think part of that is a lag. We were in a place where we were being very reactive. We were looking at what was happening in sport in terms of safeguarding in physical spaces, within relationships, that we forgot that the world was moving on. That technological advancement that's happening all the time means that the way in which we enact our lives was moving. So I had a little look and looked at the literature in the space, and this is if I was going to say for a gap today, this is a huge gap. And even looking at the process that we've been through with the recent IOC consensus, the number of papers looking at online violence is sparse. But we know it's a problem because we know it is a global societal problem, and we know that it's particularly a problem for women and girls, and that's not even thinking about the digital gender gap as well. So what do we know? These are spaces where violence can be accepted. A lot of the types of violence that were so captured in your keynote do map into physical spaces. Often it would be non-contact offences, so they can be downgraded because of that sense of not having physical contact. But that doesn't mean that it has any less impact on the recipients of that violence. When I think about the relatively developed body of work from the work that I've done, it's been more around social media and violence through social media, around major sporting events, so the risks that are posed to high-profile women, often in online spaces. Violence can be one-off contact points. It can be threats of physical violence, hypersexualized contact. It can radiate beyond the recipient. So I might be the recipient of violence, but it might be my family members that become threatened. There is a real sense of physical feeling of not being safe within our physical environment. Perpetrators, and I know I'm doing a whistle-stop tour to hand over the mic, again, this is still an area that we know little about in terms of the perpetrators of online violence. Often it can be fan-perpetrated or by those not known to us, but I look at some of the work from outside of sport by pioneering researchers such as Finkelhor, and they said, actually, it doesn't help us to go with that stranger danger approach, that it's likely to be someone that you don't know in online space, because that's a complete myth, and actually these become tools whereby people that know us can gain increased contact, increased trust. So the stranger danger perpetrator profile doesn't necessarily map. I just want to share a little bit of the data from one of our most recent studies, and I look again at where my work's moved. Initially, I started looking at this space, and we just had Twitter, I should say that now, X, and it was very much text-based. But we know that the rapid changing in online environments through images, emojis, the content of memes adds to the complexity of type of violence in these spaces. And we recently did a study looking at specifically gender-based violence on TikTok. And I think this is interesting for the room because it was club-created, brand-created content. We're going to put videos up of our female athletes. We're going to share them online. We're going to leave those up there. And the comments were wild. When I look at the overarching level of misogyny, misogynoir, sexist interactions, threats of violence, that dominant discourse that not only is consumed by the athletes themselves, but also fans, young sports fans. Other things to embrace in online spaces, and I'm conscious of my time, more than human interaction. We're not just talking about humans in these spaces, we're talking about bots and algorithms. I'm not a tech specialist, but I find it extremely fascinating because we have to really think about these platforms. I've recently been looking more specifically at can we map the types of violence that might occur within sporting settings online? So what are the specific risks to children? What are the risks to other people? What are the intersectional risks within these environments? Because we know that they map into sport, that level of intersectional harm and elevated risk of experiencing violence in online spaces. So there's a lot to be done. But what I will stress, and I know that I'm going to have the chance to talk about this more, is that please include online spaces within our discussions, but not just seeing these as separate environments. These are intertwined. We cannot separate them. It's no longer something that, oh, I should have thought about that. We have to act and we have to react and respond. So I'll look forward to talking a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Emma. Over to Nancy.
Good morning, it's great to be here. Just a big thank you to the Global Observatory for bringing us together in UNIL and the city of Lausanne and Canton de Vaud. It's really a pleasure to be able to listen and learn to the panelists who came before, and Emma, Joanna and Carrie. So I'm Nancy and I'm working at UNESCO as the lead for our Fit for Life sports initiative. Fit for Life was designed as a framework to help governments in particular integrate their action, and for us to better support them develop and implement inclusive and equitable sports and physical education policies. So tackling gender-based violence and working to end violence and deliver safe sport is a global priority for Fit for Life. This was something that was recognized in our last Global Sports Ministers Conference by 110 different countries last year. And violence prevention and safe sport also have their roots in UNESCO's International Charter for Physical Education, Physical Activity and Sport, which was first developed in 1978. And that charter establishes in its first article the right to participate in sport, physical education and physical activity for all as a fundamental right. So all of our work in Fit for Life when it comes to violence prevention is first of all geared towards understanding the roots of the violence and the patterns of the violence that we see, and then also connecting those to broader social inequities and seeing how we can work to support governments unpack them. So we're very much focused on normative work in UNESCO, the development of normative instruments, trying to understand what the levers of change are in systems, our policy systems, our training systems for coaches and educators. And we also are working a lot on trying to establish a common understanding of violence across our member states, looking at violence in multiple forms, intersecting forms, and also understanding that violence happens in a continuum for the most part, which is quite important. So all of our work in UNESCO and Fit for Life is really based on inclusion by design principles. So we've been undertaking a lot of different consultations in the last 12 to 18 months to understand from stakeholders who are practitioners, survivors of violence, those in government and sport, what are the key needs that they have, and then try to connect that back to our mandate. There's a few major challenges that we see. One is that there's no harmonized approach to safeguarding and violence prevention across countries and across sports disciplines. There's no common definition. And this is a huge challenge, as Carrie also set out in her presentation. We have some data, but the data we have just simply isn't good enough. It's very patchy. You have more data in certain countries and certain regions. You have more data in certain sports or at certain levels, elite versus grassroots, school sport. And there's also more data available on certain types of violence. As Carrie again highlighted, socioeconomic violence is something that we really lack data on at the moment. There's also a lot of specificities to the sports sector and sports environment that we're looking at in UNESCO, trying to understand how we can better connect government policies with sports administration and policies in the sports sector more directly, and understand how the specificities of the sports environment exacerbate patterns of violence where it relates to certain processes, protocols, levels of impunity. And then we see two real lacks of capacity to deliver. Even when you have policies or safeguarding programs and trainings, there's a real lack of capacity within stakeholder groups to actually implement them effectively. And then there's a lack of diversity in leadership, which I was super interested in listening to the discussion of that panel as well, because we believe that a lack of diversity in leadership positions has a direct knock-on effect on many different things, including how we tackle violence. So to respond to some of these challenges, our member states have asked us to focus on three particular areas. We're looking at how can we strengthen the data or research policy nexus? How can we do better at helping governments actually develop and implement their policies based on data? The second area that we're looking at is capacity building. Capacity building on all different forms with policymakers, also coaches and educators. And then also awareness raising, communication, advocacy, and I know Joanna's going to speak a bit more about that. So in terms of that first area, strengthening the data or research policy nexus, we've been working on a number of different activities in close consultation with members of our alliance, including the Global Observatory. We're looking at addressing basic data gaps in this area with new and unique global sports policy survey that we're going to be rolling out in the next few weeks. It's much broader scope than gender-based violence or violence prevention, but it has around 9 or 10 questions that are specific to those areas. We're also working to support standardized measurement. This is a really big issue. How can we use the same kinds of indicators? How can we start collecting data and then aggregating that data across countries and disciplines? And we're working to undertake a kind of analytical piece of work, a mapping, to really understand what are the greatest needs in safeguarding and violence prevention. What can a policy institution like UNESCO do to come in and address those gaps? So that's a piece of research that we're going to be working on over the next months. When it comes to capacity building, we've been developing new tools, policy toolkits, handbooks. We have a handbook on tackling violence against women and girls that we developed with UN Women and the UN Spotlight Initiative. We have a policy toolkit for governments which helps them understand how to integrate gender equity from the development of their policies, the design, through participatory processes, right through to the monitoring and implementation. And we're also, with the data we're going to collect from our sports survey and some of our different pilot projects, working to develop a kind of GPS, like an orientation diagnostic tool that can be used by our member states to help them understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of their current policies. In terms of awareness raising and communication, which is a huge challenge, and one that we've been focused on a lot in the last 12 to 18 months, just in order to create a consensus and increase the traction across different regions in the world. We've been organising lots of different consultations and events. Most recently, we had 2 ministerial conferences on the eve of the Olympics and the Paralympics. Gender equality, violence prevention were 2 major themes there. We took this as an opportunity to launch and promote a 10-point call to action that has been endorsed by our member states. And we also launched a Change the Game campaign, which was a social media campaign where we were looking to engage civil society more broadly on understanding what violence is, the forms it comes in, and the impact it has. And that campaign, we were just concluding, it had around 900 million different people that engaged over the 2 or 3 months that we held it. And we have a lot of other work like that on the horizon, but I just want to finish now by saying that events like today are so important for institutions like UNESCO. I think the power that we have as a policy institution that has direct access to 194 member states is really enriched and complemented by the research, the data, and the needs that you can communicate to us today, to me, and in the months to come. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Nancy. Over to Joanna.
It's me now. So just briefly introducing myself, I'm from Brazil and I'm a former professional swimmer. And I also come from a place of personal lived experience of abuse in sports that happened when I was a child. So obviously it has impacted not just my career, but my life. It has brought me to where I am today. I started doing advocacy back in 2008, not even knowing that there was a term to what I was doing. So there was just like a perfect match that moved me to work at the Sporting Rights Alliance. For those who are not familiar, we are a coalition of civil society organizations that fight for human rights in and through sport. So among our partners, we have Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Football Supporters Europe, World Players Association, ITUC, the Army of Survivors, Committee to Protect Journalists, and ILGA World. So each of those partners, they bring those expertise, and then we brainstorm the strategy on how to move the needle and make sure that sport is safer to all stakeholders, and especially the most impacted and vulnerable stakeholders. We do believe that sport can be a force for good, but that potential can only be achieved if we address properly those issues, especially gender-based violence and violence against women and girls. So needless to say that advocacy is at the core of everything that we do at the Sporting Rights Alliance, and we approach gender-based violence and violence against women and girls through a responsibility and accountability lens, meaning that we are the watchdogs that call upon sports governing bodies and governments to address it properly, but not just that, but to make sure that victims and survivors are part of the solution and are not seen as labeled as people who damage the reputation of the sport. When we disclose something, when we come to say this has happened to me, we are part of the solution. We're not part of the problem. So we advocate to have a seat at the table, not just one seat, but a lot of us, we like to co-create and be part of that solution. So through the network that I coordinate, which is the program that I coordinate, is an international network of people with lived experience of abuse in sport. It's taken us 2 years through the needs assessment to launching the network, because I'm a firm believer that if we want to serve the most impacted, we have to do it in a loyal and meaningful way. So I do not take any decisions just because I am a survivor of abuse. I do it collectively and through an advisory council that is composed of people with lived experience, different types of abuse. And we do it collectively. We launched the network a couple of months ago, and we already have members across 18 countries. So it's a group of almost 100 people who has been impacted by violence and abuse in sport. So now I'm going to share a couple of examples on how do we approach gender-based violence and violence against women and girls. As advocates, we do a lot of casework. But it's not just casework for the sake of exposing those cases. We deal with cases on a regular basis, and the vast majority of those cases are dealt internally. So the public doesn't know that that has happened. What we do on the first contact is to offer this safe and brave space for these people to disclose. And we heard from Carrie the difference between disclosing and reporting. And from a trauma-informed lens, creating those safe spaces and be there, start from this place of kindness to actually hear what these people are talking about is extremely important. So sometimes what we do is we listen, and a couple of things that we have to offer is an emergency fund, because no one profits from disclosing an incident of harassment and abuse. It's quite the opposite. So we do have, one of our activities is an emergency fund so people can use for psychological aid, for legal aid, anything that they might need to move forward on their healing journey. Other times is the emergency fund plus an analysis on the pathways to justice, and we heard from Carrie. It's not clear to athletes, and especially those most vulnerable, to kind of understand the pathways to justice, the reporting system, who has the mandate over what. So we kind of do that analysis and then present to them, always making sure, and sometimes like show like the worst case scenario when it comes to victim blaming and being sued by defamation, because it's extremely common. And in other times, it's all of that plus going public through advocacy campaigns. But I think what is really important to say here is we only go public when those women and girls, they want to be vocal and at the forefront. By no means we gatekeep their voices or use their cases for the benefit of the Sporting Rights Alliance. It's quite the opposite. So a couple of cases that we have worked, and all of this is on our website if you want to take a look into how we approach it. So the women's basketball case in Mali, a case that has happened many years ago, and until this day, we're still working and in communications with them, offering the emergency fund for appeal and so on. So it's not over. The Afghan women's football team, yesterday we disseminated a statement calling on the IOC to take better care of these women, to protect and make sure that they have the right to play sport. Muslim women and girls in France who have been forced to choose between playing the sport or their religion. And then most recently, the Indian wrestlers case, where we went to India, we interviewed those victims and survivors, we've written a report, a mini documentary, we held a press conference, and now we are on the next steps of our advocacy strategy, which is following up with the sports governing bodies and the government to make sure that they answer to the questions that were raised by those athletes. And just to wrap up, because I know that I only have two minutes, when people ask me like, what is advocacy? Going back to my story, I started advocating because I was looking for healing. And I still do look for healing to my own story, and that's why I do what I do. But advocacy is not just about winning. It's not just about I'm calling for reforms and if you get or do not get. It's mostly about standing against power, but most importantly is standing in solidarity with the most vulnerable. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to the panel, and thank you, Carrie, for joining us. And I'm glad I invited you back up, because my first question actually relates to something that you said in your presentation. So we know that there are different definitions, different ways of understanding gender-based violence, and that can lead to different methodologies, different research designs, and of course that can lead to a fairly incoherent picture, or what Nancy referred to as a kind of patchy data. So I would just like to sort of open the discussion by asking the panel to reflect on how we begin to kind of understand gender-based violence. Is the term sufficient? Do we need to expand it? Do we need to reduce it? Do we need to reconceptualize it? What is the starting point for this?
I think it's on. Okay. Very difficult questions. No, I think that we should not use it. I think it's has we are not there. It was in the past. We are further. It has something to do also, I think, with the technological development, but it also has something to do with what is gender and how many gender do we have, and gender identity and gender expressions and sexual orientation. So it's, I mean, violence in itself is complicated, but I think it's, and it gets more complicated because we're talking about sport. Celia Breckenridge introduced non-accidental violence, and the position statement from IOC in 2016, we embraced that. But because it was so that we could see the difference between violent acts that are permitted in sport because it's a part of the rules, you know, particularly physical violence in wrestling or whatever with sport we take. So Celia felt that it was necessary to separate between this, what is okay in sport, and the other things we are talking about. Non-accidental violence, maybe we should continue with that. I don't know, but very few people from 2016 to 2022 used it. So in the IOC position statements that are just gone through review, will be published very, very soon. We are back to, or not back to, it's interpersonal violence that are used a lot. And of course, self-directed violence. But one can of course talk about, from the beginning, I read in the UN document that it was violence against women and gender-based violence was used interchangeable. But no, what is a woman? So that's also problematic. So we cannot, I think it's in relation to sport, we can use violence and define it, and but we have to solve this with this violent act that is okay in sport. So maybe I don't know if this, maybe non-accidental violence, as Celia Bracken suggested, needed more years to be internalized, or maybe you who are English speaking can find a better word so that we can see the difference between the violence that are okay in sport and the violence we are talking about.
Anil, do you want to come in at all?
I think that is a very, very challenging question to ask us. So all I can respond really is acknowledging all of the points that Carrie made. At UNESCO, we talk about gender-based violence. And the reason we say gender-based violence is because where possible, we want to create the connection to structural roots and broader patterns of inequity. I think the use of interpersonal violence in sport as opposed to outside of sport is a really important point, and I'd like to kind of learn more and discuss more further. Some of the consultations and the conversations we've had about the use of that term have given us kind of feedback around concerns that interpersonal violence can reduce the violence to single incidences or to an individual perpetrating that violence rather than creating that broader connection back to structural roots of the violence. However, that doesn't discount all of the points that Carrie made, is that we don't really have data or research right now that allows us to talk confidently about gender-based violence in sport. So yeah, that would be my tuppence worth.
You know, I think there are some, whatever gender is, there are some areas that one can define. For example, gender. I've done some study for the armed forces in Norway to look at the sexual harassment and bullying in the military, and I think that that gender harassment, that you can say is gender-based violence, whatever how you define it. And it's said that we have so few studies in sport on gender harassment, which I think we should have done or should do much more, because if you the tradition that sport has in relation to traditional gender, with a masculine connotation of sport, I think, and I think we've seen, even though we don't have data, there is a lot of gender harassment going on in sport. So that we need data on that. I would call that gender-based violence. I also think that if we lay on the definition this gap that we have in sport with economic violence, one could say. But I think that economic violence not necessarily need to be gender-based violence. So it is complicated. We are like going in a circle in one way. Let me just raise another problematic. We are talking now about violence as we know what violence is. But violence is in itself, it's very complicated and covers a lot of areas and behaviors.
Okay, thanks. I'll move us away from thinking about concepts. We might return to that in a different discussion later. But Jana, I'm quite interested in the role of advocacy in this space. It's very important for hearing the voices of those that have been impacted. But I wonder what the limits are to advocacy and how we translate advocacy into policy, practice, action.
Well, I think that there's a limitation, and any sort of avenue that you decide to tackle the issue of harassment and abuse in sport, there's going to be limitations in it. If you are doing research, there is a limitation in research. If it's applied research, the same. Advocacy, the same. So I think it's about recognizing the limits of advocacy. To me, from a trauma-informed lens, the boundaries are the people who I'm trying to advocate for. They will set up the tone, and they will let me know how they want us to support. That's where the limit is. And I can say this about the Indian wrestlers case. Like, we've been in constant communication with those women and girls since last year. And when you create a safe space for people to disclose, you're probably going to be given a lot of details. So the report that we have that is not published is an investigative piece, because those women, they felt safe to disclose to us because we've taken a lot of care into like thinking about the questions, like how do you pose those questions. So they opened up to us in a way that they haven't opened to the safeguarding officer in India, for instance. And when I got that report, I kind of thought, this cannot go public because we need to be responsible. So we can keep it if and when the Indian government or the IOC or the Wrestling Federation kind of decide to take it properly, we can give them with their permission so they can move forward with the investigation. But what's going to go public, we need to be careful and mindful, because once it's there forever. So we created a methodology on kind of like deduct the terms to make sure that it's trauma-informed, not just for the Indian wrestlers, but for the readers as well. So that's kind of where I think that the boundary is. And another thing is the Sport and Rest Alliance, we do have a lot of communication with governments and sports governing bodies, but we use that contact that we have to make sure that they have a seat at the table and their voices are the one that is heard. Like at the end of the month, we're going to have an open panel with the Human Rights Commission in India, and they have invited us, and we're like, yeah, sure, but what about the wrestlers? We can be there with them. So that's where the boundary is for me, is to make sure that we serve them. I think this is the most important thing, if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. So I think I'm going to move into kind of some of Emma's work, because the digital space can also be a space for advocacy, right? But it can also be, or we know it as a space of violence too, right? And it's part of that changing geography of violence. So Emma, do you want to just reflect on, I guess, the role of the digital space in this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I think it also, I say this, it hasn't helped with definitional hygiene or clarity, and I think that part of that is because these spaces are evolving. So we used to talk about cyberspace, that might be a term that we're aware of, and it was this like non-real space that kind of sat out there, and then we were using terms like virtual. But we realised that often, especially when thinking about terms like violence, virtual can minimise, or it can remove that sense of it being real or tangible. So rather than these being spaces that were separate, and I mean, I'm going to show my age now, but I remember like dialing up and just consuming information from online because you couldn't edit it, you couldn't add to it. And then we saw the advent of social media, and that was one of the huge changes in terms of us being able to create user-generated content. So not only could we consume, we could become creators of fact, of knowledge, we could build websites, and that was a huge change in that space in terms of it becoming closer, more intimately connected with our lives. So that notion of these spaces now not being separate, but being entwined, being part of who we are, that, okay, well, it could come through a phone, but it doesn't mean that I don't feel it in the room. It doesn't mean that your presence isn't felt. And I look at some of the work that we've been doing recently has been about specifically asking women about their experiences, women involved in sport, about their experiences of using online environments and online additional safety work that's needed just to remain space. And that's opened my eyes to other types of violence that have been, again, it's moving so quickly. So I can think about one of the participants who liked to map and put their information on applications like Strava, but that then meant that their movements were very predictable. And thinking a link to a controlling intimate partner relationship, that people, or they were turning up where she was training, and that threat to physical safety then was no longer just online. So as I mentioned, technology is changing, that we need to be agile because of these shifts in the tools that are available, the tracking, privacy settings. We're right on the edge of changes to data protection. One of the things around England is trying to make us one of the safest places online, and that again is going to change. Like, where does responsibility lie? Is it on you as a user to keep yourself safe, or can we, and I believe we can, and collectively as sport, lean more on social media companies, on technology companies? So it's constantly changing, and I think every time I feel like I'm there, something new comes out, or there is a shift in this space that we need to be responsive. And AI is going to be one of the most significant changes for all of us moving forwards, both in the future of keeping people safe, but also responding to violence. So yeah, there's loads to think about.
And I think that the changing geographies of violence make it very difficult to find that normative resolution, right? So I'm going to turn to Nancy and just ask about the role of UNESCO in kind of standardising practices and finding a normative resolution, or at least attempting to in this space.
Well, UNESCO is quite well placed, I think, for this kind of work. As a standard setting institution, we have a long track record in developing standards in AI, in education, and in science and technology and sport. We are the UN agency that worked to develop the Anti-Doping Convention, the Convention Against Doping in Sport, which was paired with a sport code and creation of WADA. So, there's definitely precedence there. We have the charter I mentioned in my introduction. And in addition to having that kind of track record of developing these normative instruments, we have our 194 member states. So we have a good convening power. And I think that's critically what it comes down to, is building consensus. And that's where I think that advocacy is so important, connecting the data to the advocacy, helping different countries, different institutions to understand the relevance of harmonizing and developing these kind of standards for them, the benefits that they would get back, the impacts that would have. We also have in UNESCO our intergovernmental fora, so we have our Global Sports Ministers Conference, we have our intergovernmental committees. So I think we have a lot of the mechanisms. There's been a lot of progress we've made in the last 12 to 18 months since our Global Sports Ministers Conference. We've done a lot of advocacy and work internally with different governments around the world, and we've managed to get significant traction. Like, now you have a majority of countries who are open to learning more about the advantage or the possibility of this standardized framework. One of the things that I think is really powerful precedent is that for the first time ever, we have a decision which is going into our executive board, which is like one of our governing bodies, next week, on this. on safeguarding, on violence prevention. And it's the first time in UNESCO's history since we were founded that we have entire blocks of countries voting or backing the decision. So it's a first step. The decision is asking UNESCO to look further into the feasibility and relevance of developing some kind of harmonized framework for this. And then that's paired with the analytical work and the advocacy. So there's a huge amount still to do. But I do strongly believe that UNESCO can play a kind of leading role, but not alone, right? In partnership with other UN agencies, with academics, with the sport movement as well, yeah.
What's the importance of data for UNESCO? You know, we've talked about this kind of patchy data set. How does UNESCO use the data it has to try to kind of build some sort of normative resolution?
Well, we use the data in lots of different ways. We collect the data in order to feed into our advocacy. We collect the data in order to help us understand also as the Secretariat where the real needs are, where we need to be prioritizing our activities and the investments of our time. And then ultimately what we want to do in Fit for Life is collate data from different kinds of sources, survey data, quantitative and qualitative data. And we want to, I mentioned this GPS tool that we're developing, have a kind of diagnostic tool that will bring the different data together and help a government understand practically and clearly where the strengths and weaknesses are in their policies, their investments, and critically what they can do to change that. So data sits behind everything that we do.
Okay, so we've just had the 3-minute sign. So I'm going to use the last couple of minutes to ask the panel to just provide some reflections on the conversation we've had. It's been wide-ranging, so there's no need to kind of come up with some summary of what we talked about today, but just kind of reflections on some of the kind of key points that we've discussed in the last half an hour.
I think my reflection is just, did someone take a picture? Because I'm in a panel with Carrie Fasting, and I need to put that on my CV. Yeah, that's my takeaway.
There was a reason why I invited her back up.
It's true, I think I'm fangirling as well. So, I mean, from me, I'll stick with my topic, but there's so much to take. I think it's the richness of being in here and being challenged to think critically about the definitions that we use, what they mean for the data that we collect, but also what happens in practice. I mean, it seems so simple, but it's absolutely critical. I guess specifically thinking about online environments, let's open up our conversation. Response matters. It matters to see this as a real environment where people can experience harm, and having in place clear safeguarding policies, strategies, understanding what we will do in response to violence that occurs online is really, really important. I'm going to speak to the words of Kirsty Burrows, so heading up the Safe Sport unit, who had a very interesting experience during the games time around online violence, but she said it's going to take institutional courage in this space. Like, sport really can lead the way, and lead the way in terms of it's a micro environment where we see violence enacted on a gross, a large scale in terms of online violence, but we can be at the heart of response efforts. And that for me also feels very empowering and exciting in terms of the space that we have for a platform for change. So
I suppose my reflection would be that I think we have expertise, we have will and motivation to change the way that things are right now. I think what we need to try and do better is identify ways that we can pool our resources. I think we're all in different ways under-financed, under-resourced. So how do we better integrate our action? And just coming back to our hosts of the meeting today, I think the Global Observatory can play a super, super important role in helping us integrate data, connecting those things to policy outcomes, and just creating visibility for a lot of the good work that is going on that maybe not everyone knows about.
Okay, anyone else? Joanna, Carrie, last minute.
No, I just would like to say that I think it has been very, very interesting listening to these young women. I would like to take the opportunity to say that it's common knowledge or whatever in all kind of policy, also for states, that their actions should be based on knowledge. So it should be based on research. I think it's not a secret to say that in sport we have had some knowledge for a long time and we have not seen that it has been used. Actually, you more or less talked about it also, about leadership, Lucy. So there is a space there where it's important to work. A study in Canada, or a study led by Canadians many years ago, looked at different safeguards. We didn't call it that, but preventions. There were 6 different places in the world, and looked at if they were based on the research we already had. And they were not. They were just taking out of the air in one way, or maybe on some people's personal experience. What do I know? But it is important that this is followed through in relation to practice. And that's actually the implementation phase here also. Because now we are so far, come so far maybe that we can agree upon that it exists in sports, it's important to have safeguards, it's important to have policy, but it doesn't help if that policy is not implemented.
Okay, thank you so much. Big round of applause for our panel.